Rain poured steadily on the thatch rooftops of a remote village tucked into the foothills of a range the locals called the Sleeping Giants. The drumming on the wooden eaves formed an unrelenting orchestra of water, a persistent, rhythmic beat that echoed the unsettled hearts of the villagers. Wind lashed through narrow dirt streets, rattling the shutters of modest homes and stirring up puddles of mud. It was impossible not to feel enclosed, trapped by the storm, by the mountains, and by something else. An air of tension pervaded the settlement, lingering like an icy draft in a room with no door. No one spoke openly of it, yet every villager felt a heavy, inexplicable burden. They were all weighted down by guilt for deeds they couldn't quite remember. Long before the storms came, they'd been happy in a simple way, content with their routine. They lived off potato fields, berry-laden bushes along the forest edges, and the occasional passers-by who traded supplies. A single street bisected the town from west to east, ending in a circular clearing where a crumbling wooden church stood. All occasions, births, weddings, harvest fairs, centered at that old church. It was the heart of the community, even if it had faded into disrepair. That's why when the tall stranger arrived with a warm smile and priestly robes, no one questioned his sudden appearance. They welcomed him as though they had been waiting for him all along. His voice was deep and reassuring, carrying the promise of consolation. Within days, the villagers began confessing their transgressions, as if guided by some irresistible force. For many, the confessions felt cathartic, though none were entirely sure what, precisely, they were confessing. Elna, a middle-aged mother of 4, was the first to kneel before the stranger, tears streaming down her face as she recounted dreams in which she had stolen something precious. In these dreams, she couldn't tell what the item was, only that it was essential. Imagined or not, the shame came alive in her chest, a searing brand of guilt lodged in her heart. Others followed in a steady procession. They admitted to lying, cheating, seeking revenge. They listed a litany of supposed sins that felt as real as the rough-hewn pews beneath their knees, though they had no concrete recollection of ever committing such acts. Their confessions felt urgent, crucial. The newcomer introduced himself as Preacher Gideon. He was neither old nor young, somewhere in the indefinite middle, his silvering hair curled around a gaunt yet gentle face, highlighting the intensity of his eyes, so dark that they seemed to drink in light. Some days, those eyes would glimmer with reassuring warmth, as if reflecting the love of a shepherd guiding his flock. Other days, they took on a forbidding depth, reminding the villagers of a thunderstorm's rolling darkness on the horizon. Gideon never demanded money or material goods. Instead, he asked for confessions of guilt. He told them that absolution would set them free. Night after night, locals lined up outside the tiny confessional space in the old church, waiting their turn, listening to the muffled whispers and sobs from those who went in before. At first, villagers found solace in Gideon's presence, but a subtle transformation took hold. Alongside the guilt, they began to experience nightmares, vivid, draining illusions so thick they felt like real memories. One might awaken drenched in sweat, convinced they had been complicit in a betrayal decades prior. Another saw herself poisoning rats in her grandfather's barn, but the rats in her dreams wore human faces, moaning in agony. The lines between reality and imagination blurred, and these twisted recollections fueled an even deeper sense of self-reproach. Each morning they hurried to Gideon, hoping his prayers would soothe their frantic minds. Yet the more they confessed, the more these tortured visions multiplied. Marta, the oldest resident, was nearly 80. She lived alone in a small shack on the outskirts, where wild rose bushes tangled with weeds. She prided herself on her memory. She had once been the village storyteller, the keeper of genealogies and local lore. At first, she too felt an odd twinge of guilt. She dreamed of drowning a child in the river, saw the little body vanish beneath dark water, then woke up choking on tears. But unlike the others, she resisted the notion that this dream was a recollection. Instead, she told Gideon flatly, "I know I never did such a thing." She recited the events of her life as if reciting a well-loved poem, highlighting there was no room for such a crime. Gideon offered her a mild smile, pressing his hands together in a gesture that hovered between sympathy and impatience. He assured her that all souls had hidden evils. Marta left the encounter unconvinced, but burdened by a sense of creeping doubt. The preacher's services became a daily ceremony of shared shame. Whenever a storm broke overhead, or whenever the roiling skies threatened to burst, Gideon declared that these tempests were an outward manifestation of their collective sins. The storms were intensifying, pounding the rooftops day after day, fostering floods in the field, turning farmland into swampland. Farmers watched in dismay as their crops withered. Children coughed and shivered in the soggy chill. In the midst of this chaos, Gideon stood unflinching. He said that punishment, in the form of the endless rains, would only subside when every soul embraced complete honesty, confronting the darkest corners of their hearts. Elna's nightmares started to include a recurring face, a girl with braided hair, eyes closed in anguish, an accusatory stare upon awakening. Elna could smell the damp earth in these visions, hear the echo of a shovel striking ground. She suspected she had buried this girl somewhere in the orchard behind her farmhouse. She wept and prayed, but no specifics about time or motive came. At sunrise, she found herself drawn to the orchard, scanning the rows of trees for any disturbed soil. There was none, yet the certainty of her guilt weighed on her. She couldn't sleep. She barely ate. Her husband and children seemed distant, their own minds entangled in confessions of unclear wrongdoing. News of Gideon's fervent preaching seeped into every crack in the village. Even those who resisted initially, reasoning that they had lived uneventful, principled lives, found themselves plagued by hints of uncertain wrongdoing. Some nights, prayers echoed through the church as thunder boomed in the distance. The villagers cried out for mercy. The feeling in the air was one of creeping inevitability, an impression that each person was complicit in something monstrous, something best left unnamed. They gathered, side by side, tortured by illusions of secret crimes, unsure how to separate the dreamed from the real. Gideon seemed aglow amidst their anguish. He walked among them, resting a supportive hand on a trembling shoulder or whispering a prayer into a fearful ear. He promised deliverance for those who surrendered fully. One evening, Marta returned to the church, resolute. She had spent hours poring over her notebooks, her meticulously kept accounts of births, deaths, local legends. She thought that if any wrongdoing were real, she should find at least a rumor or snippet recorded. These crimes people were confessing to, even if covered up, would leave some trace behind. Unexpected disappearances, injuries, or feuds. But her pages were clean. Yes, there were minor quarrels, petty disputes, but nothing matching the magnitude of the nightmares. The next storm was rolling in, clouds bleached ominously by lightning. Marta found Gideon praying at the altar. Candlelight danced on his taut features. She approached him, her notebooks clutched in a trembling hand. "I've looked," she declared. "These crimes are not real, or at least not as we remember them. Something else is happening here." Gideon settled his intense gaze on her. "We all carry burdens of sin, even if hidden," he said calmly. "Some cannot be found in books or memories. They dwell in the soul." "But if sin is hidden so well," Marta pressed, her voice quivering with a hint of anger, "how do we even know it's ours?" A flicker of amusement, or perhaps annoyance, passed across Gideon's eyes. "You feel it, do you not? That heaviness? That stain that weighs on your conscience?" he replied. He walked closer, the rustling fabric of his robe swallowing the hush around them. "Confess it, and you will find your relief." Marta's heart pounded. She realized there was something hypnotic about his words, something that coaxed fear and shame to the surface. She felt that if she listened too long, she might stumble into the same pit of confessions the others had fallen into. She backed away, determined to maintain what clarity she had left. The next few weeks saw the rains intensify further. Soon the winding dirt roads turned into trenches of mud, and the farmland was all but ruined. Livestock sickened, treetops bent low under the weight of the constant deluge. Families started to whisper about curses. An unspoken suspicion began festering. Perhaps one particularly vile soul among them had brought this endless storm. There was talk that if the guilty party refused to confess, all would suffer. Fueled by Gideon's daily sermons highlighting the primal need for atonement, suspicion and paranoia blossomed. Friends eyed each other warily. Accusations brewed beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. Fear. Denna's orchard dream escalated. She not only saw a young girl's body, but a row of them, lined up under the trees, their faces pale and lifeless. Waking from these nightmares, she screamed in terror, consumed by the sensation that she was a serial murderer. Yet no children were missing in reality. She forced herself to confirm it, knocking on neighbors' doors, counting heads, checking that every household's kids were present. They were. And yet she'd discover muddy shoes by her bed, the smell of damp soil on her nightdress, and the distinct taste of dirt at the back of her throat, as if she'd literally been digging. She turned herself in to Gideon repeatedly, kneeling for hours, begging to be forgiven for these unknown atrocities. One moonlit night, Marta crept around the darkened church. Guided by suspicions and stubborn curiosity, she brought with her a small lantern. The confessional doors were locked, but the side door leading to the sacristy was unlatched. She slipped in, the lantern flickering across stacks of religious tomes, dusty chalices, and a battered trunk. She recognized the trunk. It was a relic from the old church, rumored to contain the diaries of priests long gone. She'd read them once, many years ago, and they had been typical. Logs of blessings, traveling missionaries, complaints about the region's remoteness. Now, though, she noticed new scrolls and transcripts overflowing from within. Carefully, she unrolled one page, scanning the lines. It seemed to be an account in Gideon's handwriting, referencing gruesome deeds with the names of local villagers scrawled beside them. Specific crimes, murders, betrayals, acts of cruelty too hideous to speak of. A chill traveled up Marta's spine. The next parchment detailed steps on how to induce confessions by manipulating dreams and guilt. Words like hypnosis, suggestion, and collective delusion peppered the text. Not entirely comprehending how such knowledge might be put into practice, Marta felt the unsettling reality that Gideon might be orchestrating these visions to gain power. But why? She read further, heart pounding as she uncovered references to draining spiritual energy, feeding on faith, and becoming a vessel for absolving illusion. The entire framework dripped with an eerie mixture of theology and psychology. It wasn't purely supernatural, nor entirely rational. A cunning mixture of fear, hypnotic induction, and perhaps something more, swirling into a plot that ensnared the unwary. Just then, she heard a footstep on the church floorboards. Closing the trunk quietly, she snuffed out her lantern and wedged herself against the nearest pillar, breath held tight. Gideon's silhouette emerged through the doorway, a candle in his hand. The flame illuminated his eyes, which seemed even darker in contrast. Marta's chest tightened as he descended the aisle, pausing by the trunk to rummage through it. His lips moved silently, perhaps reciting a prayer, or more likely sealing away some new evidence of his manipulations. After several tense minutes, he left, locking the trunk behind him. She waited until his footsteps receded, then slipped out the same way she came. The next morning, Marta found the villagers gathered outside the church at dawn, each one wearing a look of profound shame. Gideon stood at the top of the church steps with arms raised. He proclaimed that the flooding was an omen for the final stage of their penance. If you confess truly, if you let your hearts bleed of all the wrongdoing buried there, the storm shall cease, he declared. Some villagers sobbed openly, promising to do anything to end their torment. Others simply hung their heads, convinced of their irredeemable depravity. Stepping forward, Marta defied the hush. These sins, she announced, voice shaking but carrying across the muddy clearing, are illusions planted by this man. He thrives on our suffering. He's twisting our minds. The crowd shifted uncertainly. Some looked at her in horror, others in surprise. A hush fractured into low murmurs. Gideon did not interrupt her. Instead, he let her speak, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. She told him about the parchments, the diaries, how the crimes had been fabricated and inserted into their dreams. I don't know how he does it. Maybe some technique of suggestion or trickery, but I've lived here my whole life. We have enough real troubles. These so-called sins are not ours. She trembled from more than the chill in the air. Confronting Gideon so directly felt dangerous, like shaking a sleeping viper. Gideon's voice was almost gentle as he replied, "My child, you mistake divine revelation for an illusion. Sometimes, the true nature of our hearts is revealed not in memory, but in prophecy. We have all committed sins in our hearts, if not in deed. The storms come for that reason." He addressed the onlookers. "But look at your own nightmares. Do you doubt your guilt, or do you sense how your hearts are stained with malice?" Torn, the assemblage wavered, uncertain whether to align with the elder teller of tales or the preacher who had guided them through weeks of spiritual torment. A ripple of indecision spread. Elna, powerless from her nightly horrors, rose her voice. "If it is not memory, then why do I wake with mud under my nails?" Another chimed in. "Why do I taste blood in my mouth each dawn?" Gideon's influence hung thick in the humid air, urging them to cling to guilt. After all, guilt granted the promise of eventual redemption, no matter how painful the process. Doubt seemed more frightening, a path into chaos, into meaninglessness. Gideon offered an explanation, screening them from the random cruelty of a world battered by storms. But Marta stood firm, determined to break his hold. Gathering her courage, she yelled, "You're being controlled. He's harnessing your faith against you." She pointed an accusing finger at Gideon. "I've seen the documents in the trunk. He planned every last detail, from your nightmares to these illusions of wrongdoing." Lightning flashed overhead, thunder rattling the wooden beams of the church. Gideon's nostrils flared. "Satan can sow confusion," he hissed, "taking many forms. I ask you all to look at your hearts. Who here has not felt the stirring of wickedness within?" His eyes narrowed at Marta. Then, with a grand sweep of his robe, he stepped down from the church steps and approached her. The congregation parted like waves, letting him pass. Water ran in rivulets down his face as the rain redoubled. Marta's pulse drummed in her ears as she realized Gideon meant to confront her more directly. But even in her fear, she noticed the shifting expressions in the crowd. Individuals like Elna hesitated, uncertain. Some pairs of eyes flicked from Gideon to Marta and back again, their hearts wavering. She decided to show them something more tangible. She pulled out a ragged document she had stolen from the trunk, a single page detailing how to induce nightmares with repeated suggestion, references to incremental guilt, anchoring illusions, and the repeated mention of villager names. She held the page aloft. "Read it!" she shouted. Thunder subsided momentarily, leaving her voice stark in the air. "This is the true face of your so-called preacher. He uses manipulative tricks to make you believe you've sinned, fueling your nightmares. He thrives on your confessions." A collective gasp rose. Gideon snatched at the sheet, but Marta slipped from his grasp. "You think to present a page of scribbles?" he said, voice brimming with anger. "As evidence of my alleged deception?" His composure cracked for an instant. An undercurrent of menace freed itself from his usually pious facade. "There is no deception, only revelation. You reject the truth at your peril." But Elna, who had stood trembling on the edge, recognized her name scrawled on the paper, next to outlandish references to hidden graves and ghostly illusions. A glimmer of realization came over her features. "I recognize those phrases," she whispered, recalling they had echoed in her confessions to Gideon. Shaking violently, she looked at him with horror. "You planted these nightmares in my mind, didn't you?" Shouts erupted. Anger, fear, and confusion swept over the crowd. Some turned on Gideon, eyes ablaze with betrayal. Others clung desperately to the idea that their confessions were real, because the weight of false illusion seemed too large to bear. A group stepped closer to the preacher, forming a protective semicircle around him, while others pressed forward. Outraged, Gideon's face twisted, half righteous fury, half desperation. Rain battered the ground. The sound of water swirling around ankles filled the clearing, as the storm seemed to intensify in response to the mounting confrontation. In the chaos, Gideon lifted his arms. His voice carried above the roar of the elements. "You question your very souls? You would rather be ignorant of the stains that mark you?" Something flickered in his eyes, an anguish or longing that was shocking in its rawness. "I have come to save you, to purge you of your hidden darkness. Don't fall prey to the lies of this old woman who cannot accept the truth." At that, the preacher's eyes flickered strangely, his pupils contracting to pinpoints. For an instant, it seemed he might strike Marta or attempt some further manipulation, yet the strength of collective doubt swelled as retrieved bits of Gideon's documents circled hand to hand, their typed or scrawled words exposing instructions for dream invasion, group hypnosis, guided guilt. Elna and others stepped away from Gideon's orbit, their faces set in grim lines of anger. "We will not repent for sins that were never ours," Elna said, voice trembling yet resolute. Gideon bellowed, "Then you doom this village to the deluge." Thunder hammered overhead, so close it shook the ground. Rain pounded, quickly turning puddles into miniature lakes. Water licked at doorsteps. But the crowd, liberated from the paralyzing shame that had consumed them, began moving away from him. Perhaps the storms were not the direct result of sin after all, but natural weather patterns, or some freakish climate event. Perhaps Gideon's words had become little more than hollow threats. Collectively, they resolved to face the storm itself rather than yield to the tyranny of imaginary guilt. Lightning flashed, illuminating Gideon's expression, a twisted betrayal of something deeper than rage. For a moment, it looked as though he might collapse from frustration or cast some final incantation. Instead, he turned abruptly, marching through the swirling waters toward the dark silhouette of the church. The thick downpour swallowed him up. The door slammed behind him, leaving the villagers stunned and soaked, hearts pounding from the confrontation. In the following days, the storms did not immediately relent. It rained with a dogged determination, drenching the fields. Yet without Gideon's voice fueling their nightmares, people began sleeping a little better. The confessional lines vanished. Gradually the torrent started to ease. Day by day, the water receded. Crops remained damaged, but the sense of foreboding lifted. A hush of disbelief settled over the village. They still felt shaken, unsure how they had slipped so easily into the thrall of a preacher they knew so little about. When the roads dried enough to travel, a few villagers braved the slog up to the church, intending to confront Gideon. They found the doors thrown open, the interior stripped. Papers were scattered, candle holders overturned. The trunk in the sacristy was smashed. Gideon was gone, leaving behind only the evidence of his manipulations. No one knew where he had disappeared to, but they feared he might set up a new congregation in some distant place. Quietly, they restored their lives. They fixed the broken roofing, repaired the soggy farmland as best they could, and gathered in homes to share meals. The illusions of guilt still haunted them sporadically, especially in the small hours of morning. But each time a nightmare seized one of them, they recalled Marta's unwavering stand. They worked to remind themselves of what was real, forging a new kind of solidarity in their shared brush with deception. Elna led the children in replanting seeds for the next growing season. Others helped patch the roads. Marta resumed her role as a storyteller. In her subsequent tales around a flickering fireplace, she recounted the time a stranger came, convinced them they were all criminals, and nearly drowned them in fear. The moral she offered was twofold. Faith can be a balm, but in the wrong hands it can become a weapon. In remembering, they found protection against future illusions. Weeks turned to months. Gentle rains came and went, nurturing the newly planted fields without the threat of floods. Days of warmth coaxed fresh green sprouts from the once devastated soil. The villagers carried the memory of Gideon and his confessional trap like a collective scar. Even the children, whose carefree days had been punctured by nightmares, began to laugh and play again. The world felt like it was awakening from a terrible dream. Still, in the hush of dawn, sometimes a villager would awaken with the echo of a half-remembered crime stirring in their chest, a flicker of remorse for a deed they never really did. But they had learned to question, to investigate. They had grown vigilant against blind guilt. They acknowledged those flickers as ghosts of a powerful suggestion left by a manipulator who exploited their innate yearning for redemption. That lesson, though hard-earned, fortified them against the next tempest, spiritual or otherwise. No one forgot Preacher Gideon. Now and then, travelers passing through the region brought rumors of a tall, pale man wandering with a tattered Bible, offering salvation cloaked in arcane confessions. Some speculated that Gideon was no mere mortal, but a demon, or restless spirit, thriving on the confessions of the living to stave off his own condemnation. Others insisted he was just a talented con artist, skilled in psychological cunning. Regardless of who or what he was, the specter of Gideon's methods persisted, as a constant reminder of the power of suggestion, the vulnerability of the human mind when it yearns for release from guilt. And so the villagers remained watchful. The battered old church stayed empty, its walls echoing with mysteries unsolved, its corners shadowed by the memory of the man who had turned their devotion into a prison of anxiety. Yet the community survived, and even thrived, bonded by a new caution and unity, because in discovering that they had been coerced into repenting sins they never committed, they also learned that the strongest defense against manipulation lies in their shared vigilance, and in standing firm upon the simple truth of what they knew and did not know within their own hearts.